Hi, this is Dr. Claire. Today we're going to be talking about some evolutionary misconceptions. So we're going to start by talking about what evolution is, and then we'll get into some of the ideas of what evolution isn't, okay? So to start with, let's go back to our definition of evolution. And I'm going to be harping on this throughout the semester. Our definition of evolution that we'll be using for this class is that evolution is the change in the genetic composition of a population over time. So again, there's those four components: change, genetics, population, and time. You should remember that individuals do not evolve. An individual is born with whatever genes it has, and those are the genes it's going to have for the rest of its life. What evolves is actually population. So when the genetic composition of a population changes, regardless of the cause of that change, that is evolution. So in this little illustration here with our little green and brown beetles, you start with one population that's primarily green beetles. For whatever reason, brown beetles are more successful than green beetles, and gradually over time the population becomes dominated by brown beetles instead of green beetles. And so that's a change in the genetic composition, presuming that the color of the beetle has some genetic foundation. That would be a change in the genetic composition of that population over time. So that would consist of evolution, regardless of what caused that change. All right. So let's talk about some of the most common evolutionary misconceptions. One that I hear a lot is that evolution is just a theory. And this one arises from the way in which most people use the word theory and the way in which scientists use the word theory. In science, theory has a very specific definition. And in science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world. So it's the explanation for which we have a huge amount of evidence. We have tested it a bunch of times. It's always true, or it always is supported by whatever data that we collect. And so because of that, we become very, very confident in this explanation, and so then we start to call it a theory. There are other scientific theories, the theory of gravity, for example. You wouldn't doubt that if I drop this mouse here that it's going to fall. There's a theory that explains why the mouse falls towards the planet, and that was the theory of gravity. There's cell theory. There's a number of other different scientific theories, and we only really get pushback on the evolutionary theory. So theory in popular culture often means some harebrained idea that you just came up with, but that's just not what it means in science. And so this is actually an argument that's just scientists and people who aren't scientists kind of talking past each other. So it's not really a very good argument for why evolution is not true. Another misconception about evolution is that natural selection involves individuals trying to adapt to get what they need to survive. So that kind of implies that an individual, given a stressful situation, can make some sort of change to themselves that's going to allow them to survive, and then that change gets passed on. But that's not really how it works. So for example, this beaver here, as much as he would like to have a chainsaw hand, is not going to get a chainsaw hand just by thinking about it. That variation has to exist in the population, and individuals who have that variation then have an advantage over those who don't. They reproduce more, they leave more of their offspring, and those offspring then are more abundant, and so the trait that they have becomes more abundant in the population. So that's how natural selection actually works. And an individual can't pass on a trait that it acquires in its lifetime. So think of it this way. Let's say you go to the gym and you pump a bunch of iron and you get really swole, you get big muscles, right? And then you have a kid. Is your kid going to have giant arm muscles? No, they have to go pump their own iron to do that. So you can't pass on those traits to your offspring. Natural selection also can't sense what an organism needs to survive, and natural selection doesn't create the variation that exists. That variation has to exist in the population beforehand, before it can be passed on. Another misconception is that evolution is a theory about the origins of life. It actually isn't. Evolution is a theory about how life changes over time. It doesn't really tell us how life began in the first place. And we don't really know for sure how life began in the first place. We have a lot of hypotheses about how life may have started on this planet. And some of those hypotheses have varying amounts of support, but none of those hypotheses has risen to the point where it has enough support from enough different sources that it can be considered a theory. So we don't really have a theory about how life started on this planet. We do have a theory about how life changes once it's here, and that's evolution. Another misconception is that evolution always makes things better and more complex, and that organisms that are more complex are superior and higher on the evolutionary ladder than other organisms. Again, it doesn't necessarily make things more complex or superior to each other. What it does is it makes organisms a better fit to their environment. And the environment can change. So what is a good fit now may or may not be what's a good fit in the future. And so evolutionary pressures do not remain constant through time. And also complexity may not always be the best solution. My favorite example is the horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crabs are an aquatic arthropod. And I've got two pictures here. I've got a modern horseshoe crab that was, or it's a shell of a modern horseshoe crab that was collected alive. And this is a 500 million year old fossil of a horseshoe crab. They have not changed substantially in 500 million years. They are really, really good at being horseshoe crabs. So horseshoe crabs, it's a body design that's a really good fit for their environment. The shape that they are lets them scuttle around on the ground and eat detritus and mate and breed, and they do really well in their particular form. And so because that's a really good form for their environment, there hasn't been much selective pressure to change that, and so they're more or less the same. Just to give you a frame of reference, mammals on this planet, I just said that's a 500 million year old horseshoe crab. Mammals have only been around for about, I believe, 80 million years. So we're talking an animal that has remained constant for an extremely, extremely long time. Okay. Evolution is referred to as the survival of the fittest. And so survival of the fittest, a lot of times you think, okay, well, that's the most complex, the most intelligent, the whatever. But what fitness actually means, it doesn't mean physical fitness. So animals doing exercises, that's kind of ridiculous. But what fitness means in this context is the number of offspring that are left to the next generation. So in order to have high fitness, you need to both be able to survive and you need to be able to reproduce. So if you can be the best at surviving, you can avoid every predator, you never get eaten, you live a really long time, you live to 100 years, but if you can't get yourself a mate, you're still going to have low fitness. Whereas you could be, like I'll say we're taking a bird, I give lots of birds examples. You could be the sexiest bird on the planet, you've got lovely plumage, you've got a fantastic song, and you can attract every female in the region, but you can't fly very fast and you get eaten by a cat. Also low fitness. So you have to both be able to survive and reproduce in order to have a high fitness. Another misconception is that evolution means that life changes by chance. There are some random components to evolution. Some of the mechanisms through which populations can evolve are random. Mutations are generally random. They occur in random places throughout the genome. And genetic drift is a random process. We'll talk more about genetic drift next week. But natural selection is distinctly not a random process. You have variation within a population, and some individuals do better than others based on that variation. That's not random. So this particular example here, we got our brown and green beetles again. In this particular case, there's a bird that really likes to eat green beetles. It doesn't particularly care for brown beetles, and so brown beetles are going to have higher survival and therefore higher fitness. That's not a random process because the green beetles are being preferentially plucked out of that population. So it's not a random process. Another misconception is that evolutionary theory is in crisis and that scientists are losing confidence in it. Again, this is, I think, a misunderstanding about how science works. Scientists argue about all kinds of things all the time. And actually, taxonomists who study the evolutionary history of different groups love to argue about these things. They go to conferences and they yell at each other about which organism is more closely related to which other organism. They're not arguing whether evolution exists or not. They are arguing about the exact path through which evolution went in history, based on the evidence that they have today about, is species A more closely related to species B, or is it more closely related to species C? There's no argument about whether the species A is evolving, just who it's more closely related to. So that's actually not an evolutionary crisis. It's just a scientific debate. And so scientists try to find evidence to support their hypotheses, and then they'll go to conferences and argue with each other about it. Another misconception is evolution isn't science because it's not observable and it's not testable. This is patently false. We can observe evolution happening on small time scales all the time. If you take the example of antibiotic resistance is a great example of evolution. So when you take an antibiotic, you are subjecting all the bacteria in your body to very strong selective pressure. That antibiotic is going to kill most of those bacteria, but if there's some variation in that population of bacteria in your body, and some individuals in that population are better able to resist that antibiotic, then they're the ones who are going to reproduce because they weren't killed by the antibiotic. They're going to proliferate, and then you have an antibiotic resistance population of bacteria living in your body, and that's a bummer. It's happened to me because I was once on a antibiotic IV. My appendix ruptured, and I had to be on an IV drip of antibiotics for 3 days, and everything that was left after those 3 days was antibiotic resistant, and it took a really long time to get rid of them all because they were nasty little bugs. So we can observe evolution happening on a very, very short time scale. It happens all the time. It's happening all around us all the time. We can't go back millions of years into the past and observe previous evolution, but we can actually observe it happening today, and we can conduct experiments on it. So there have been many experiments. This is a little guppy down here at the bottom. There's been a bunch of experiments on guppies where they subject them to different selective pressures in the lab, and they can actually observe those little guppies because they have a lifespan of about 3 or 4 months. And so you can subject them to selective pressure and watch their populations change over a very short period of time. So it's definitively and very easily observable and testable in some contexts. And then my last misconception is that biologists have rejected Darwinism. I've actually had people ask me if I'm a Darwinist, and I'm like, I'm not a Darwinist, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I mean, Darwinist kind of sounds to me like you're worshiping Darwin and he's the best guy ever. That's not really what I do. I see the evidence for evolution. I see the evidence in the animals that I study. I have actually incidentally caused evolution in a bird. I didn't mean to, but it happened. There have been no credible scientific challenges to the theory of evolution, and the vast majority of biologists, in the high 90%, accept that evolution happens and that it is a fact of life on this planet. Hope you enjoyed the talk today. Catch you next time.